Hi everyone, welcome back to chapter 6. In this video, we're going to finish up chapter 6 and operant conditioning. So the final thing we're going to talk about is shaping. So shaping is kind of like a precursor to operant conditioning. It's how we kind of select the behaviors that are going to be used in operant. So in shaping, then differential reinforcement of successive approximations of a target behavior occur. In other words, it's kind of like pre-training. We're training the rat to do a behavior that it will later use to complete operant conditioning. And how we do that is by rewarding behavior first very generally, and then we slowly become more specific in the behavior that's reinforced. So a great example is training a rat to press a lever. So at first, this is not a natural behavior that rats do. So at first, we'll reward the rat, so give the rat food, if it just even approaches the lever. If it just goes to the side of the box the lever's on. So it'll start to associate that side of the box with food. And then we'll start reinforcing the rat for a slightly more specific behavior. So now when it sniffs the lever. So when we get to level 2 where it sniffs the lever, once we start reinforcing sniffing the lever, we will no longer reinforce the rat for just approaching it. So now approaching this side of the box is not good enough. It needs to do more. So it'll sniff it. Next, we'll reinforce it for touching the lever. So reaching up with its paw to touch it. So rather than touching it with his nose, he now has to touch it with his paw. So this can take a while, but they will learn it. And then will finally reinforce only when the rat fully presses the lever down. So puts pressure on the lever and pulls it all the way down. And this is how we can reinforce the behavior of pressing the lever. And now that shaping has occurred and the rat now knows how to press the lever, we can now use that lever in operant conditioning, so training the rat to press the lever when the light is green versus red, when it hears rock music versus classical music, things like that. So we're really kind of training a behavior that we're going to use in operant. So shaping is used to develop a target behavior that a person or animal doesn't currently exhibit. It's defined as that differential reinforcement of those successive approximations, so as we get closer, until the person or animal exhibits that target behavior. Okay? Now, what are some guidelines that can help us with our shaping? How can we get that shaping to occur quickly, make sure it occurs properly, that kind of thing? So when shaping behaviors, then some important guidelines starts with, first you have to define your target behavior. So before you even start, you need to know exactly what behavior you want to occur at the end. Then you need to determine whether shaping is even what you need to do. Is it the appropriate procedure? Or is the behavior you want to shape actually a behavior that the person or animal already has? If so, you don't need to shape it. If not, you will need to obviously undergo shaping. Then you need to identify what your starting behavior is. So with that rat, then remember the starting behavior was just approaching that side of the box. Okay, and then you need to actually decide before you start what your shaping steps will be. Otherwise, it can get confusing. So one example I have with shaping is the game Hot and Cold. You might hide something in the room, and then play a game where someone has to find it, and you give them hints of going, are they hot, are they cold, getting hotter, and as someone gets closer, then something you might have said, like turning the right direction, you might have previously said, oh, getting warmer. But now that they've done that multiple times, you're not going to say that anymore. Now they have to actually walk that direction. They can't just look that direction, okay? So that game tends to go easier if you decide ahead of time when or how many clues you're going to give them before they have to start, getting better. They have to actually get closer in order to now be rewarded with saying, getting hotter, okay? Then you need to choose your reinforcer. So in the game Hot and Cold, your reinforcer is just telling them they're getting warmer. In the instance of the rat, the reinforcer is food. Okay? So different reinforcers can work. Then you need to actually differentially reinforce those successive approximations. You need to actually do shaping in the way you planned. And you also need to move through shaping at a proper pace. You don't want to go too fast. They can't just do the behavior one time before moving on to the next step. That's not going to be enough for them to build that association. But you also don't want to spend too much time because then they might get bored. Or if you're rewarding them with food, they might get full and then they don't really want more food. So then you're kind of stuck. There's also some tips for shaping that your text gives, and they're very good steps. So when generating a novel behavior, so like pressing the lever in a lab rat, or maybe you're getting your dog to do some tricks, then these tips will help, okay? So one, you want to reinforce in small steps. So make sure your steps aren't too big, because then you could actually kind of lose yourself and you'll have to go backwards and go back a step. You also want to use continuous reinforcement. Okay, so you don't want to wait a long time. You want to make sure that there's a strong relationship between the behavior they're doing and what they're being reinforced for. You want to provide that immediate reinforcement right away. So don't wait and see if they'll do it more. When you're first training your dog to sit, you don't say sit. They sit and then you just ignore it and then be like, okay, let's see if they'll do it again. No, when they're first learning to sit, you need to praise them every time they sit. Now, once that behavior is shaped or fully learned, then you can back off on the reinforcement. But when you're still learning, then you need that immediate, constant reinforcement. You also want to provide a small reinforcer or a conditioned reinforcer. So this prevents satiation. So again, you don't want to give your dog a full hamburger every time they sit. You just want to give them a little piece of a hot dog or a little treat. So by providing these small reinforcements, then it keeps your subject focused on the task. They can't get distracted. They're still motivated, okay? Now another tip is you can skip ahead if your animal suddenly starts doing a behavior that's, say, step 4 and you're only on step 2. So with the rat pressing the lever, if the rat, all of a sudden stands up and presses the lever and you're only on sniffing the lever, you should still reinforce that behavior. Because even though you said you were going to reinforce sniffing and you pressed it, because that's the desired behavior, you should still reinforce it. Also, background noise, my kitten found some paper. So, I'm trying to distract him. Also, if you need to back up to a previous step, do that. Okay, you want to make sure that your subject is lined up for success. So if you skipped ahead and they say the rat pressed the lever the one time, you're not all of a sudden probably going to only reinforce for pressing the lever. You might need to back up and continue reinforcing for sniffing because that might have just been a fluke. Okay, so don't be scared to back up when necessary. Also, following a successful shaping, so now you have that behavior that you want, you need to move to intermediate schedules of reinforcement. Instead of a continuous reinforcement, we're going to do intermediate. So instead of rewarding your dog for sitting every time they sit, you're now going to reinforce, say, every other time or every third time. But you only do that once shaping has been successful. Now, another thing I want to talk about is with shaping, we talk about how shaping's used only on novel behaviors, so like tricks for your dog or pressing a lever. But you can actually use shaping for other behaviors, even if it's not completely novel. So you can actually use shaping to reinstate a previously exhibited behavior. So, for example, let's say you had a cat, got super fat, and stopped walking. Well, now your cat is on a diet and needs some exercise. So you want your cat to start walking again. So your cat knows how to walk, but it just refused to walk, right? So you can actually use shaping to reinforce the behavior of walking. So you might start with just reinforcing a crawl, and then maybe you'll reinforce your cat for standing up, and then taking a few steps, and then eventually maybe you'll only reward your cat for walking all the way across the room, stuff like that. So you can use shaping for a non-novel behavior. You can also use it to change some dimension of an existing behavior. So say, you taught your dog that they go to the bathroom every 3 hours. Well, now you have a new job and you'll be gone for 6 hours. So you can actually use shaping to train your dog to have a different behavior. So the amount of time between going outside to do their business. So first you'll reinforce them for every 3 hours, and then maybe 3.5 hours, 4 hours. You get the idea. Okay? So we can reinforce just changing, say, the magnitude or some dimension of that existing behavior. We also want to mark the behavior. So what we can do is actually kind of indicate to the subject, whether it's an animal or a human, what behavior specifically we're reinforcing. And that's where, say, clickers can be used. So clickers are used so that an immediately conditioned reinforcing consequence is provided. So it aids learning by providing that immediate reinforcement, and it prevents an accidental reinforcement for other behaviors. Because sometimes your dog will start to sit and you'll want to reinforce that, but then by the time you have the treat out, they're standing again. And you don't want to reinforce them for standing, you wanted to reinforce them for sitting. But there was too much time between them sitting and you getting the treat out. So that's what clickers are good for, because you can just click really quickly when they started to sit, and they'll be like, oh, that part was good. And then, you can reward them with food later. But the clicker is more of an immediate response. And that's why clicker training tends to be used, because it leads to less confusion about what behaviors are being reinforced. Now, you can also, of course, shape problem behaviors or use shaping to get rid of problem behaviors. So child tantrums or other problem behaviors are something that can definitely involve shaping, parents yelling or nagging, showing off, dogs begging for food. And a lot of times these behaviors can actually occur because you're unknowingly using differential reinforcement. In this example here, so this is a fun little comic strip that's showing shaping behaviors with problem behaviors. Then we've got a mom and a kid, so we're going to call the mom Mrs. Smith and the kid Tommy. Okay? So Mrs. Smith is trying to reduce the disruptive behaviors, but Tommy keeps interrupting and wants to play. Okay, so Mrs. Smith says, I'll play later. Now, when she says I'll play later, then we get that like extinction of the whining. But then Tommy will run away and start screaming. So that extinction of the behavior of him whining actually bursts. Then concerned Mrs. Smith will calm him down and start playing with him. And that's actually a negative reinforcement because she's reinforcing the behavior of him screaming by removing what in his mind was a bad thing, so her not playing with him. So then, if screaming occurred, it's then ignored, and then there's a crash. So Mrs. Smith is now concerned, helps put pieces of the toy truck back together. Later, when screaming, the kids could start screaming a lot, throwing toys, and that's because Mrs. Smith has actually reinforced multiple behaviors. So she's reinforced screaming by then being like, okay, I'm playing with him. And then she's been reinforcing him throwing things. So when he throws his truck around, and that's because she then goes, picks up the pieces and puts it back together. So even though she's trying to be a good parent and, she's picking up, she's playing with him, she's only playing with him after he does something bad. She's picking up after him after he does something bad. So he's thinking, if I do these bad things, I'll get attention. And so this can actually lead to an increase in these problem behaviors. So she's actually unknowingly used differential reinforcement of successive approximations. Okay? We can also use shaping for verbal behaviors, such as learning to speak. So when we're teaching a child to speak, then they actually start pretty, not full sentences. They use babbling. So familiar sounds that sound like words, so like da, ma, and then put things together like dada, mama, papa, things like that. And we reward them. We're like, oh, good job, you did great, yay. And then as babbling becomes like words, so from saying da 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 to dada to daddy, you're going to stop rewarding when they just say dada to only reward when they say daddy. And this is just something that we kind of naturally do. And then as we get older, daddy turns into dad or father. Instead of rewarding them every time they say truck when a car goes by, because they generalized all vehicles as truck, as they get older, we'll only reward them when they say the right word. So truck, car, minivan, that kind of thing. Okay, so that's how we can use shaping for verbal behavior, so learning to speak. We can also use it for like asking things and for what we call manners. So if there's salt on the table and they can't reach it, they could say, please pass the salt. The listener hears that and will then pass the salt. Now, because the speaker received the salt, so that would be a response or a stimulus, of receiving the salt, the response to receiving the salt would be to say thank you. And then the listener would hear thank you. So you can see how we're going back and forth here between stimulus, response between two people. And it reinforces the behavior of using your please and thank yous, of doing nice things for others. Now, there is this one thing called the matching law, which has to do with verbal behavior. So this is a procedure where there's 4 confederate delivered differing rates of verbal reinforcement to a subject. And the results in this instance was that the subject's rate of responding was strongly predicted by the matching law. So the matching law is that the relative state of responding is equal to the relative state of reinforcement. So if we go back here, what it's saying in the matching law is that since the speaker said, please pass, the listener heard it and then passed. If the speaker didn't say thank you, or didn't say please, then the listener would be less likely to actually pass the salt, okay? So the listener's responding because of what the speaker's saying or what the speaker's doing. So the rate of responding of the listener is equal to the relative rate of reinforcement available. So saying please and thank you is a stronger reinforcement than just, say, smiling at someone, right? So I'm more likely to hold the door open for someone, say, if I think they're going to respond with a thank you, than just kind of ignoring me, right? So you're more likely to do something nice for someone if they're more likely to do something nice for you. And that's just what the matching law is saying. And this is actually related to the shaping operant conditioning. So for a summary of Chapter 6, we talked about what is classical conditioning, what about classical conditioning led us to operant conditioning, how we got here, what we can take from classical conditioning to apply. We talked about some old white dudes called Thorndike and Skinner who loved their boxes, might have been cats in another life, and that really Skinner did not actually, keep his daughter in a box her whole life. But you should know how operant boxes work. We talked about all the different types of reinforcements and punishments available, and we talked about the importance of shaping and how that plays a role in operant conditioning. Now, this is the last chapter that will be covered on your midterm, so make sure that you do have this information right. Make sure you understand it, and if not, send me an email. Also, make sure you have an example of classical conditioning ready. Remember that I assigned that to you in the past few videos, that you need to do some sort of classical conditioning at home, and on the exam, I'm going to ask you about it, and you're going to have to tell me all your different variables, what the goal was, and then just if it worked or not. Even if it didn't work, you still get points. I just want to make sure you understand classical conditioning and are able to apply it. As always, you can email me any questions you have. I'm going to try to get your Chapter 6 reading quiz graded before the midterm, but no promises. It might be Thursday at the latest. I'm working on Chapter 5 right now. So, again, let me know if you have any questions, and good luck studying. I will make an announcement about the information regarding the exam and how it's going to work, so look for that announcement on Blackboard.